You've seen the castles, the knights, the muddy villages in every medieval drama. Harsh, yes, but there's always firelight, always the glow of a sun somewhere overhead. But what if one morning that light never came? What if you opened your eyes and the sky was dark blue, the sun barely more than a ghost behind a curtain of ash? No warmth, no growth, no end in sight. Not for a day, not for a season, but for nearly 2 years. This isn't fiction. This isn't legend. In the year 536 CE, the world changed in a way that few survived and even fewer understood. Welcome to the darkest chapter in human history, the year the sun disappeared. You woke up to the sound of the rooster crowing, but the light that usually followed never came. Your eyes opened slowly, expecting the familiar glow creeping through the wooden shutters. But instead, the room remained wrapped in a strange, dim blue hue, like twilight stretched unnaturally into morning. You blinked a few times, trying to adjust. Everything looked wrong. Not pitch black, not storm dark, just off, like the color had drained out of the world. The mattress beneath you, little more than a rough sack stuffed with dry grass, crackled as you shifted, poking your legs with broken stems. A cold draft slipped in through the gaps in the walls, making you pull the coarse wool blanket tighter around your shoulders. You could smell the faint smoke from last night's fire, still clinging to the air, but there was no warmth left in it. You sat up and glanced across the single-room house. Your mother was already crouched near the fire pit, trying to coax embers back to life. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes kept drifting toward the window. Your father stood by the door, his broad back tense as he leaned just slightly forward, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The silence was strange. You could hear the rooster again, this time from farther away, its call uncertain, but nothing else answered it. No birdsong, no voices from the neighboring houses, just a kind of heavy stillness that pressed against your ears. You slid off the mattress and stepped toward your father, your bare feet flinching at the cold, packed earth beneath them. "What is it?" your mother asked, her voice low but tight. Your father didn't turn. "Come see." You stood beside him as he opened the door. The wooden latch creaked, and a breath of frigid air swept in. You blinked hard. Outside, the world had changed. The sky, instead of the soft pinks and yellows you expected, was a deep or bruised blue, not like a storm was coming. This wasn't cloud. It wasn't rain. It was something else. A haze, thick and silent, clung to everything. The sun, if you could call it that, hovered low and faint behind the mist, pale and cold, more like the moon than anything that could give warmth. And the strangest thing, you could look directly at it. It didn't hurt your eyes. Behind you, your mother gasped. "Is that—" Your father shook his head slowly. "No, it's not an eclipse. Doesn't feel like one." Neighbors were stepping out now, too. Doors creaked open one by one. A few muttered prayers. A baby started crying somewhere. You caught sight of old Elena, the oldest person in the village, wrapped in a thick wool cloak, tapping her cane in the dirt as she made her way toward the center of the square. Her white hair looked almost blue under the strange sky. People turned to her instinctively, like they always did. She had seen things, wars, famines, harsh winters. She was supposed to know. "It's the end," she said simply, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The end of days, just like the scrolls warned. Darkness over the land." Your father let out a breath that was almost a scoff. You said the same thing when the two-headed calf was born. Elena's eyes glinted. And was I wrong? There were a few nervous laughs, but they didn't last. Your gaze drifted to the small group of chickens outside your home. They had stepped out of their coop earlier, like always, but were now huddled near the door again, pecking uncertainly at the ground. One let out a startled cluck and darted back inside. Even the animals knew something was off. The cold crept deeper into your bones. It wasn't supposed to be this chilly. It was March. There should have been the smell of thawing earth, the promise of green shoots poking through the soil, but now the air felt like the edge of winter, sharp and still. Your breath rose in pale clouds. You reached for your father's tunic, pulling lightly. Why is it so dark? He hesitated, then knelt to your level. That's when it scared you, because he didn't smile, didn't reassure you. He just looked at the sky again. I don't know. And your father always knew. Still, he stood. Come on, we've got chores to do. The words rang hollow, but he was trying. He always tried. You followed him toward the small shed with the plow tools, the grass crunching underfoot with frost. The fields stretched out beyond, silent and pale. Normally, the morning would be filled with calls, neighbors greeting each other, animals calling out, birds flitting overhead. Now it felt like the world had paused. No shadows stretched from your feet. The light wasn't strong enough to cast any. By midday, or what should have been midday, the light hadn't changed. The same eerie half-glow clung to everything. You watched your mother wrap her shawl tighter and stoke the fire again. She didn't say anything, but her hands shook slightly. Your stomach ached, not from hunger, not yet, but from the heaviness pressing in on everything. Like something vast and ancient had turned its gaze on your tiny village and decided to leave it dim and cold. That evening, the fire inside crackled louder than usual. No one spoke much during dinner. The goat had barely touched her feed. The chickens hadn't laid a single egg. You chewed slowly on barley bread, stale but warm, and listened to the wind moving against the thatch. When your father finally spoke, his voice was softer than you'd ever heard it. If this doesn't pass soon, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. And that's when you began to understand. The day hadn't just missed the sun. It had missed something deeper, something that once gave the world rhythm, taken in an instant. You lay awake on your mattress that night, listening to the strange silence outside. The stars, if they were there, couldn't be seen. The blue haze lingered even in the dark. You didn't know it then, but that moment, that day without a dawn, was the first page of a chapter the world would never forget. The next morning brought no change. The sky remained the same eerie shade of dusky blue, and the light from the sun, if it could still be called that, hung weak and lifeless above the village. It didn't rise or fall, just hovered behind the veil of mist, offering no warmth, no direction. The fields looked frozen in time, and the air carried a strange stillness, not the calm kind, but the heavy, watchful kind that settles before a storm. You stepped outside with your father again, this time not out of curiosity but habit, and were met by more of the same unnatural silence. Not a single bird sang, not a single breeze rustled the trees. Everything was just waiting. The chickens remained inside the coop, refusing to come out. Your goat hadn't touched her feed and paced in slow, nervous circles. Something in their behavior made your stomach twist more than the cold. Animals knew when the world shifted before humans did. Old Elena had gathered a small crowd by the well. Her voice, though cracked with age, carried clearly in the thin air. She clutched a wooden amulet to her chest and muttered warnings of judgment, of prophecies fulfilled, of skies turned blue as a final sign. Some villagers nodded along, clutching their own talismans or whispering prayers under their breath. Others argued, voices raised in frustration, not belief. One man shouted that it was smoke from a great fire in the east, that someone must have angered the gods or broken a sacred vow. Another woman insisted it was sorcery, the work of Persian spellcasters trying to blind the empire. The more they talked, the more fear poured out of them. You watched your father approach the group, his face unreadable, but instead of speaking, he stood silently, arms crossed, as if hoping for some solid answer to appear on its own. No one had one. Later that day, a young traveler arrived on foot, wrapped tightly in a faded cloak and with frost in his beard. His name was Stephanos, and he had come from the direction of Constantinople. The whole village gathered to hear him speak, hoping for a miracle, but his words only deepened the dread. "It's the same there," he said, "even in the capital. Lanterns burning all day, priests chanting nonstop, markets closing. People speak of divine punishment, or something even older." A long silence followed. If the emperor's own city was powerless beneath this sky, then what hope did a handful of farmers have? That evening, you sat by the fire with your family. Your mother stirred a thin barley soup, and your father stared at the flames as if trying to make sense of them. You turned to him, searching for the steady tone he always used when storms came or wolves howled too close. Instead, he looked tired, older somehow, as if this blue twilight had taken something from him. "Will it go away?" you asked quietly. He didn't answer at first. When he finally did, the words were simple, but they didn't carry the usual weight of certainty. "It has to." Then he stood, as if that could make it true. Outside, the night brought no darkness, because the day had brought no light. It was just more of the same endless, colorless half-world. The villagers retreated into their homes, shutters drawn, fires lit, each family huddled close and whispering. And for the first time in your life, you realized that grown-ups could be afraid. That even your father, whose hands could build anything and whose voice once steadied you during thunder, was just as lost as everyone else. You lay on your straw bed and listened to the quiet, to the windless world beyond the walls, and knew deep down that whatever this was, it was only the beginning. By the third day, it wasn't just the light that felt wrong. It was the air itself. The cold deepened, sharp and dry, creeping through the cracks in the walls and floors, turning breath into mist even inside the house. Your mother wrapped herself in 2 shawls now, and still shivered as she worked over the fire, while your father's hands had turned raw and red from chopping wood that wouldn't last the week. The frost came at dawn, settled in thick patterns over every surface, turning the fields outside into a silver crust. You pressed your hand against the window shutter once, just to see, and your fingers stung from the cold before you even opened it. It was March, and you'd grown up expecting the first signs of spring by now. Green shoots, the smell of wet soil, the distant buzz of bees. But the world had stopped moving. The garden beds lay stiff and quiet. The earth, usually softening this time of year, was hard and unyielding. Your father tried digging once, just to test it. The blade of the spade hit the ground with a dull thud and bounced back like he'd struck stone. No warmth, no moisture, no promise. The animals had changed too. The goat, once playful and stubborn, now barely moved. She huddled near the wall of the shed, her breath clouding the air like a ghost. The chickens came out only briefly during the pale midday glow, and then returned to the coop as if they didn't trust the world anymore. Even the dog, a scrappy thing with one torn ear and a bark louder than his size allowed, had gone quiet. He no longer ran or begged for scraps. He simply lay near the fire and watched. That silence echoed everywhere. Not just in the animals, but in the village itself. Conversations had grown shorter, more cautious. The children no longer played in the paths. The laughter that once drifted over fences had vanished. People moved slower, as if the cold had seeped into their bones and dulled every thought. You noticed how they kept glancing at the sky, waiting for something to change, anything. Each night, your family lay closer together around the fire. Your mother would place a warm stone near your feet, wrapped in cloth, and whisper a few words that weren't quite prayers, but felt close enough. You could feel the tension in her touch. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of what it might mean if the light never returned. Your father had taken to checking the stores again and again, counting sacks of barley, dried beans, the few root vegetables left from last autumn. You heard him muttering under his breath, running numbers no one had taught you yet, trying to stretch something that didn't want to stretch. Sometimes you caught him standing at the doorway before dawn, just watching the skies with his arms crossed, hoping, or maybe bracing. The strangest part was the feeling that nothing moved. The barley you planted weeks ago hadn't grown, not even a sprout. Your father scraped away the topsoil in one spot and showed you, seeds still whole, untouched by time, as if the cold had paused the world. You tried to help him plow a few furrows in the side field, but the ground resisted. The metal of the plow was ice to the touch, and the oxen were skittish, snorting and pulling against the yoke. After less than an hour, your father gave up. He didn't say anything, just stared at the land and then at his hands, red from the cold and trembling slightly. That night, wrapped tightly in your blanket, you felt something inside you settle into a quiet dread. Not panic, not the sharp, loud kind of fear, but something colder or slower, like frost spreading through wood, silent and irreversible. You didn't speak it out loud, but you knew. The sun was gone, the world was waiting, and nothing, not even time, was moving forward. It wasn't until the 5th day that you noticed something strange, something that made your stomach twist more than the silence or the cold ever had. You were helping your father carry a bundle of firewood across the frozen yard, the brittle branches scraping against your arms. The light hadn't changed since morning. The sky remained that endless dim blue, like someone had taken a wet cloth and smeared the edges of dawn across the whole world. And as you walked across the hard-packed earth, you glanced down at your feet and froze. There was nothing, no shadow, not even a faint outline. You turned in place, shifting side to side, thinking maybe the angle of the sun was too steep, too soft, but it wasn't that. The light was simply too weak to cast anything. You looked up at your father, about to speak, but he had already stopped. He was staring at the ground beneath him, his arms still full of wood, his brow furrowed deep. "No shadows," you said quietly. He didn't answer. You dropped the bundle and stepped to the side, checking again. Still nothing. Your own body moved through the pale light like a ghost, untethered to the earth. No echo, no outline, no weight in the world. Around the village, others were starting to notice too. A murmur passed from house to house, one that didn't rise to shouts, but carried more dread than any scream. People came out and stood in silence, each one looking at the ground, trying to find the thing they had never questioned before, and one by one they failed. Your mother joined you, her hands dusted with ash from the hearth. She looked down and then at your father. He finally spoke. "It's not just the sky," he said, as if realizing it aloud. "The light isn't real anymore." That day, the world lost more than its shadows. It lost its shape. The dimness had a way of smoothing everything: edges, colors, details. The trees no longer looked like trees, just dark forms swaying slightly in the breeze. The village path disappeared into a gray blur. Faces turned pale and flat, as if lit by candlelight at all hours. The stream that ran behind the house used to sparkle in the sun. Now it looked like a strip of dull metal, unmoving and cold. Nothing shimmered, nothing shone. It was like living inside a dream that refused to end. A dream where the sky pressed low on your shoulders and the wind carried no scent. You walked through it all with a kind of slow confusion, like you weren't sure if you were awake. Even inside the house, the change was obvious. Your home, once cozy and warm with firelight dancing on the walls, had become a hollow box of shadows. The fire still burned, but the flames felt muted, like they were pretending. The colors of your mother's woven shawl faded into a dull gray. Your father's eyes looked sunken, not from hunger, but from the way light no longer touched the contours of his face. It was as if the world had lost its depth, and everything now was a painting made with just two shades of blue and gray. Children stopped playing entirely. The village, which used to ring with their footsteps and laughter, became still. No one ran, no one shouted. They lingered near their homes, watched by anxious parents who whispered more than they spoke. Old Elena wandered from house to house now, not with sermons, but with silence, her wooden staff thudding dully on the frozen ground. Even she seemed unsure. At dusk, or what passed for dusk, the sky did not darken. It simply settled into a deeper version of what it had been all day. The same light, over and over. No arc, no movement. Time itself felt like it had grown tired. Your dreams became confused. You saw your house floating in blue fog, your father's face flickering like candlelight. You dreamed of walking through your village and not recognizing a single house. You dreamed of fields where the crops grew upside down, roots in the sky. In the mornings, you couldn't remember how long you'd been asleep. You asked your mother once what day it was, and she paused for a long time before answering. "Does it matter anymore?" she said. The absence of shadows became something no one spoke about, but everyone feared. It was too strange, too unnatural. Shadows meant sunlight, and sunlight meant life. Crops, warmth, looks, growth, everything depended on it. Without shadows, there was no measure, no shape, no difference between morning and evening. between today and tomorrow. You'd never realized how comforting it was to see your own outline moving beside you. Now, without it, you felt transparent, unanchored. Even the animals noticed. The chickens stayed inside their coop, confused and anxious. The goat refused to leave the pen. A flock of birds flew overhead one morning, but instead of continuing, they circled 3 times and vanished into the haze like they had lost their way. Everything had begun to drift: plants, people, time itself. You saw it in the way villagers paused mid-task, forgetting what they were doing, in how your father sometimes stared at the fire for hours without moving, in the way your mother would start humming a song and then stop, as if the tune no longer belonged in this world. And still, the sky remained unchanged. The pale blue disk above gave no heat, no promise. You could look at it for hours without blinking, and it never moved. No path across the sky, no gold, just a sickly imitation of the sun hung there like a forgotten ornament. That night, you lay in the dark and stretched your hand toward the ceiling. The dim glow leaked in through the cracks in the wall. You held your fingers still, waited. Nothing moved on the wall, no outline. No proof you were even there. It was the first time you wondered, if the world no longer cast shadows, did that mean it had stopped remembering us too? By the 7th day, the fear that had begun in silence now started to speak aloud, not in laughter or songs or the familiar banter between neighbors, but in murmurs, guesses, and the kind of quiet voices that said things no one wanted to believe. The cold had not lifted. The dimness remained. No bird calls, no thawing ground, no shifting in the strange pale light that painted everything with the same dull brush. The villagers had grown pale themselves, not from illness, not yet, but from the weight of uncertainty. When nothing changes, time turns into something thick and heavy, like smoke that won't clear. It was near the village well that the conversations turned serious. The men gathered there in the late morning, if it could still be called morning, bundled in thick cloaks and wool tunics, standing close for warmth, though none of them said they were cold. You weren't meant to listen, but you did, crouched behind a stack of firewood just out of sight. Your father was among them, arms folded, jaw clenched, saying little but listening hard. The well had always been a place of routine: fetch water, trade a few words, move on, but now it was a council of worried faces, a half circle of fear trying to find shape. "It's not just us," said Nicholas, the man with the largest plot of land. "A traveler came through 2 days ago from the east, said the same thing: sky like ash, no sun, crops frozen in the ground. He'd been to 3 villages, all the same." "Constantinople, too," another added, spitting into the frost. "They're lighting lamps at noon in the emperor's halls. I heard it from a priest who passed through last week. Said the emperor called for days of prayer, processions in the streets. People think it's divine punishment." "Punishment for what?" someone muttered bitterly. "Half of us haven't done anything worth punishing." "Doesn't matter what we did," said another. "It matters what they did. The empire's been at war with everyone for years. Too much blood. Maybe gods had enough." A few men nodded. Others looked down. The silence hung heavy. Then someone said what others had only dared to whisper. "Maybe it's the Persians." You felt a chill not from the air, but from the way heads turned slowly at that word. The Persians, distant, powerful, mysterious. a name that lived in warnings and stories. Some say their magic can speak to the skies, call fire, bend light. What if they found a way to blind us? They'd blind themselves, too, another scoffed. They live under the same sky. Unless they knew this would happen, unless they're shielded somehow. It's not sorcery, Nicholas snapped. It's something else, bigger, older. My crops haven't grown a finger's width in over a week. That's not war. That's the world itself breaking. Your father finally spoke, voice low but firm. The wheat's still in the ground, not a single sprout. The barley's gone gray. I've never seen that. Not from frost, not from anything. He paused. And there are no insects, not a beetle, not even flies on the compost. You ever known a spring without flies? That quieted everyone. Even Elena's warnings and the wild talk of omens hadn't been as unsettling as that. The absence of life where it should be. The fields weren't just slow, they were silent. Even decay had stopped working. Something deep in the world's rhythm had gone still. A man named Petros, thin and nervous, cleared his throat. Should we send someone to the city? Ask the officials what's happening? They won't tell peasants anything, Nicholas said sharply. We're dirt to them. They'll sit in their stone walls and pray while we starve. But if we don't ask, we'll die wondering, someone finished for him. There was no shouting, no panic, just the heavy exchange of stares, of unspoken admissions. That this was more than a passing frost, more than a strange week of weather. This wasn't something that would end when the winds shifted or the moon changed phase. Whatever this was, it stretched across land and belief, across farms and palaces. It reached from their village to the feet of the emperor himself, and no one, not even the most powerful men alive, seemed to know what to do about it. When your father returned home, he looked older, not just tired, but aged in some invisible way. You didn't ask what was said. You could see it in his silence. Your mother handed him a bowl of broth, thin and quiet as everything else, and he ate without a word. That night, the fire cracked loudly in the hearth, but no one flinched. The shadows still refused to return, and for the first time, it wasn't just your father who couldn't explain what was happening. It was the whole world. The counting began in whispers. Not loudly, not in panic, but in the kind of hushed tones meant to be hidden from the children. Only children always hear more than they're supposed to. It happened in the evenings, after the chores were done, after the house had gone quiet, after the fire had settled into glowing coals, and the pale light from the window had dimmed just enough to suggest something like night. Your parents sat by the hearth, their backs turned slightly toward you, voices low, eyes heavy with the weight of calculation. Your mother held a small cloth bag in her lap, carefully untied and spread on the floor. From where you lay on the mattress, pretending to sleep, you could see her counting dry beans between her fingers like they were coins in a treasure chest. Beside her, your father unfolded a worn piece of parchment and smoothed it out across his knee, making marks with a stub of charcoal. They spoke in fragments, unfinished sentences, as if naming the problem in full would make it real. If we stretch the barley to midsummer, but the chickpeas won't last that long, only if we skip one day a week. No room for illness, none at all. They paused often, sitting still as if the silence might offer a better answer. But the numbers never changed. There were only so many sacks, only so many handfuls of grain, only so many ways to thin a loaf of bread without turning it into a lump of bitterness. You turned your face into the mattress, trying to block out the sound, but the words stayed with you. Hunger had not come yet, not fully, but it was in the room now, quiet and invisible, watching from the corners, waiting. The next morning, the changes began. Your mother served smaller portions at breakfast, a bowl of watery broth instead of porridge, bread, but thinner slices. No one mentioned it. Your father ate quickly and went outside to check the shed. You followed, unsure whether to offer help or just be near him. He was moving sacks around, lifting one, weighing it in his hands, then setting it aside with a sigh. "We have enough for now," he said, not looking at you, "but we'll have to be smart." That day, instead of feeding the animals as usual, your father carefully measured out their portions too. The goat eyed the small bundle of hay without complaint, but finished it in seconds and stood silently waiting for more. The chickens clucked nervously, pecking at the sparse grain with growing irritation. Even they could feel the shift. That evening, you helped your mother grind the last of the old corn into flour. It had been kept aside, separate because it was bitter, only used in desperation. Now she added it to the bread, mixing it with barley to make it stretch. The result was dense and sharp on the tongue, but no one complained. Around the village, similar scenes unfolded. People began closing shutters earlier. Doors stayed shut longer. Fewer voices in the lanes, fewer gatherings at the well. Everyone was counting, measuring, hiding their fear in the clatter of tools or the scrape of spoons in empty pots. A woman named Livia, known for her loud laughter and generous garden, was seen crying behind her house. Her son had asked for a second piece of bread. She hadn't had one to give. Your mother began saving scraps with a kind of sacred reverence. Potato skins, fish bones, anything that could be boiled twice or dried for later. She told you and your siblings to finish every bite, even the burnt edges. When you asked why the meals were smaller, she smiled too quickly and said it was just until the sun returned. But her eyes betrayed her, darting too fast, avoiding your father's. One night, after your siblings had fallen asleep and the fire had nearly gone out, you heard your mother speak words you'd never heard her say. "Even if the sun comes back," she whispered, "we won't have enough to plant." Your father didn't respond at first. The silence stretched too long. Then he said quietly, "We won't survive next winter without seed." There was a pause. "So we plant nothing now?" "No," she replied. "We have to risk it. But we can't eat what we plant, no matter what happens." That was when you understood something deeper than the hunger in your stomach, as fear had weight. It settled on your shoulders, curled up in your chest, sat across the dinner table. It lived in the way your father stared at the walls, in the way your mother fingered the edge of the last good blanket, in the silence between them, heavy and unbroken. From that night on, every bite of food tasted different. Not worse, just heavier. Each piece carried a question. Was this the right choice? Should we have saved this? Could it be our last? Hunger hadn't arrived yet. But the fear of hunger, the knowledge of it just over the ridge, was already here, and it was just as sharp. It began slowly, not with the sharp pangs of emptiness, but with a quiet dullness that settled in your body and refused to leave. The kind of hunger that made your limbs feel heavier by the hour, made walking across the yard feel like dragging weights behind your feet. You woke up in the mornings feeling as tired as when you'd gone to sleep, and the cold seemed to bite deeper, clinging to your skin no matter how many layers you wore. Meals shrank. What was once a full bowl became half, then just a ladle of broth, thin and tasteless, floating with a few strands of barley or a piece of vegetable so small it felt like an accident. The bread changed too. Your mother had begun adding ground acorns and wild roots, and though it kept its shape, the taste turned bitter, dry on the tongue. Still, no one said a word. You chewed and swallowed and looked at your plate as if staring harder might make it more full. Your father worked longer hours, though the fields gave nothing back. He moved between tasks with a kind of mechanical precision, chopping wood, repairing tools, checking snares he set near the forest edge, more for the idea of food than the expectation of it. He came home empty-handed more often than not. His face grew leaner, the skin drawn tighter around his eyes, but he never spoke of the ache in his stomach. Your mother said even less. She moved with quiet efficiency, wrapping leftovers in cloth, boiling the same bones twice, stretching meals with bark flour or herbs with no flavor. But one night, long after everyone had gone to bed, you woke to a soft rustling and saw her near the fire, unwrapping her own portion of bread and crumbling it into your bowl. You closed your eyes quickly and pretended to sleep, but the lump in your throat wouldn't go away. In the morning, she smiled and said she wasn't hungry, that her stomach had been upset. But you knew the truth. She'd eaten nothing. In the village, the silence turned sharper. People began watching each other differently, not with suspicion yet, but with a kind of guarded calculation. Children stopped playing altogether. Mothers kept them close. The old men who used to gather near the well no longer lingered. One family packed their things and left before dawn, their cart rattling down the road in the dim blue half-light. They didn't say where they were going. They just went. Another family did the same 2 days later. No one tried to stop them. No one even asked. At the storehouse, the mood changed. There had always been a shared understanding in the village that food, especially seed grain, was sacred to be protected for planting. But now, even that unspoken pact began to fray. A man named Dmitri, whose wife had passed the winter before and who had 2 small children, was caught late one night trying to slip into the storehouse. They said he had pried open the side door with a farming blade. When confronted, he didn't run or deny it. He stood in the torchlight with a sack of grain in his arms and said, "They haven't eaten in 2 days. What would you have me do?" People gathered. No one shouted. No one moved. But something in the air shifted. The headman arrived, face gray, lips tight, and told the crowd that the punishment for stealing seed grain was clear. In other years, it would have meant exile or worse. But these weren't other years. After a long silence, he said, 3 days in the stocks, and your household loses 1 week's rations. Some gasped. Others nodded. It was both too much and not enough. The next morning, Dmitri stood shivering in the wooden frame near the center of the village, eyes hollow, arms exposed to the cold wind. His children watched from a distance, silent and unmoving. Tension thickened after that. Neighbors no longer lingered at one another's doorsteps. Greetings were brief. sometimes absent. Everyone began measuring what they had and what others might not. You noticed how quickly doors closed behind visitors now, how fathers watched their grain sacks like guards. The hunger, once a shared discomfort, had turned inward. It made people quieter, more alert, more desperate. That week, your mother began skipping more meals. You saw her press her hand to her stomach in private moments, her face tight with pain she would never admit. Your siblings didn't notice, or if they did, they never said. Your father started boiling soup with nothing in it but wild onions and a stone he claimed gave flavor. You knew better. You could taste the absence. At night, your dreams grew strange. You saw fields full of tall golden wheat, and when you ran through them, the stalks crumbled to dust beneath your hands. You saw a table covered in bread, meat, steaming bowls, but as you reached for them, the food faded like mist. You woke each time with your mouth dry, your belly aching. One evening, your father brought back a rabbit from a snare. It was thin, nearly starved itself, but it was something. Your mother roasted it slowly, stretching the meat into stew, serving everyone a bowl with equal care. It was the best thing you'd tasted in weeks. But as you licked the bowl clean, you saw your parents glance at each other in that way they had when saying nothing meant more than words ever could. They had not eaten. Again. This was the first week of real hunger, not just smaller portions or the threat of what might come. This was the moment when the body began to feel the cost, when sleep stopped restoring you, when the cold no longer left your bones, no matter how close you sat to the fire. And though no one dared to say it aloud, everyone knew this was only the beginning. You heard the shouting before you saw the firelight. It was still early, just past dawn, or what counted as dawn in this place, where the sun never rose properly, but voices broke the stillness outside, like cracks in old ice. You pulled on your cloak and rushed out with your father. Others were already gathering near the old grain storehouse, their breath hanging in clouds, eyes wide, boots crunching over frost-hardened dirt. The door had been forced open. One of the hinges dangled loose. A single torch cast light across the wall, catching the dust in the air. And there, kneeling on the ground, surrounded by 3 of the village men, was a figure you recognized. Toma. He was hunched over a sack, fingers still wrapped around the drawstring. His coat was too thin, his hands were bare, his face streaked with dirt. He didn't look up. The headman stepped forward, and no one said a word. Not yet. The silence was the kind that held something sharp just beneath it. When Toma finally raised his head, his eyes were red, not from guilt, but from exhaustion and grief. "They haven't eaten in 2 days," he said simply. "My boy, he cries all night. I can't do nothing." No one moved. No one rushed to help him. No one backed away either. You glanced at your father. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched, not with anger, with something heavier. The sack beside Toma was barely half full. It was seed grain, grain meant for planting if the frost ever lifted. It had been counted, guarded, stored with care. It was hope sealed in burlap, and now that hope had been torn open, not by a stranger, by one of their own. The headman didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 3 days in the stocks, he said, and your household's rations cut for a week. Someone gasped quietly. A woman behind you whispered, He won't survive 3 days in this cold. But no one said it louder, no one argued, because they all knew if they went soft once, it would open the door. If one could steal and eat, then others would, and then there would be nothing. They tied Toma's hands and led him to the post outside the meeting hall. He didn't resist. As they locked him in place, his wife stood nearby, holding their child, her face unreadable. She didn't weep. She didn't plead. She just watched, like someone who had run out of choices long ago. And when it was done, the villagers walked away slowly, heads lowered, saying nothing. There were no winners in this punishment, no satisfaction, just the echo of footsteps fading back into frost. The following days only deepened the silence. The mornings were colder than ever, the air sharp enough to sting the nose. You expected the frost to ease. Spring had always come by now, but instead, each morning you stepped outside into a world that looked like it belonged in January. Thin ice coated the troughs. Water had to be broken with a stick. The trees were bare. The garden was a grave. No buds, no green, just the stillness of cold earth refusing to yield. Your father walked the field each morning, with you trailing behind, carrying a worn shovel. He scraped at the dirt. He checked the seeds. Nothing. The soil smelled of stone. One morning, he didn't bother scraping. He stood there for a long time, staring at the rows, then quietly said, "It's dead." You didn't know if he meant the field or something larger. The animals began to fade too. The goat that once nuzzled your hand with mischief now lay on her side in the corner of the shed, eyes dull, ribs showing she wouldn't eat. The chickens stopped laying eggs entirely. You opened the coop to find one of them motionless, feathers ruffled, unmoving even when you touched her. Your father took her out in silence, buried her in the frozen ground without a word. At night, the firewood burned faster, and the warmth never lasted long. You pulled your blanket tight and listened to your stomach grumble. The hunger was constant now, not a wave, but a tide, steady, rising. You'd learned to ignore it most of the day, but at night it returned sharper, and with it came the word your mother tried not to say, K'nets. You heard it only once in a whisper when she thought no one was listening. She had bent down to stir the fire and said, almost to herself, "Is this how it ends?" Your father didn't reply. He just turned and walked outside. The village changed too. People no longer looked one another in the eye. Every step was careful, every word chosen. Arguments broke out more often, over tools, over water, over whose turn it was at the well. The frost lingered, the sky stayed the same, and the light, that endless pale blue smear across the heavens, still refused to grow or move or fade. There was no morning, there was no night, just the long, thin breath of a world holding still. You began to understand something you hadn't before. Not all endings come with noise. Some are slow, cold, quiet. Like spring that never arrives. Like the sun that never burns. Like a hunger that grows too familiar. They came in silence, just after midday, though the sky looked no different than it had at dawn. A group of soldiers, 8 men in dull bronze armor with the imperial crest etched into their cloaks, entered the village without fanfare, their boots cracking the frost beneath them with each heavy step. You saw them first from the corner of the square, their silhouettes forming in the pale haze like figures rising out of mist. They didn't speak. They didn't smile. Their faces were drawn, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and stiff from cold. They were supposed to be symbols of strength, order, protection. But these men looked like shadows of themselves, the shine worn off their armor, the resolve worn off their faces. The villagers gathered cautiously, keeping distance but close enough to hear. Your father was among the first to approach. He didn't bow. He didn't challenge them either. He stood straight and waited. One of the soldiers, older, broader in the shoulders, with a deep scar that curved from his left cheekbone to his ear, stepped forward. He looked around, taking in the quiet, the frost, the sagging houses, the too thin children standing beside too thin mothers. Same here too, then, he said. What's happening? Your father asked. Is this across the empire? The soldier nodded once. From Antioch to Thrace, even in the capital, it's like this. The sun's gone blue, the crops won't sprout, and the days won't warm. Someone behind your father muttered, Is it punishment? The soldier snorted, not with humor, just fatigue. If it is, it's punishing everyone. Priests are praying in the streets. Rich men are lighting fires at noon. Emperor Justinian ordered torches in every hall. He doesn't know what it is either. Another soldier, younger, leaned on his spear like it weighed twice what it should. They say it's the Persians. Magic, smoke in the sky, curses from the Zoroastrians. Others say it's God, added a third, that he's turned his face away. The older soldier shook his head. Or maybe, he said slowly, it's the mountain. People exchanged glances. The mountain? There's talk, he continued, of a fire mountain far in the north, a great one. Some merchant from the north coast says it exploded, threw ash so high it touched the sky itself, blackened the clouds, killed the light. That word stuck in your mind, mountain. Not a god, not a spell, not punishment, a place, a force, something from the bones of the earth, fire in stone. You had never seen such a thing, could barely imagine it. But the way he said it, so low, serious, like he didn't quite believe it, but feared it anyway, it felt real in a way that omens didn't. Where are you going? Your father asked him. Italy, the soldier answered. Orders are orders. The emperor still wants the campaign continued. Goths regrouping in the west. We're to push forward, darkness or not. But how? Someone asked. How do you fight a war when you can't see the enemy? The soldier looked at him with tired eyes. The same way we plant seeds in frozen ground, with hope or with madness. They didn't stay long, just long enough to rest their horses, demand some food, take what little the village could spare without outright theft. Your father offered 2 loaves of bark bread and a jug of watered wine. The soldiers didn't thank him. They accepted it like taxes. One of them tossed a coin into the dirt, more insult than payment. When they rode out, their footsteps left no shadows behind them. That evening, your father repeated the word to your mother as you sat near the fire. Volcano, he said, a fire mountain that poisons the sky. Your mother frowned. That sounds like stories from far away. Things people make up when they don't want to say, we don't know. Maybe, he answered. But it's something. You sat with your knees to your chest, thinking of a mountain so big it could eat the sun. Could ash really fly so high, so far, that it would reach even your small village? Could fire touch the heavens? Outside, the sky remained unchanged. No wind, no color. Just that endless dimness, quiet and heavy like breath, held too long. But something had shifted. Until now, no one had dared give the darkness a name. Now it had one, vague, foreign, but solid. And even if it didn't make the hunger easier, or the frost gentler, or the nights shorter, it gave the fear a shape. And shapes, at least, can be faced. The next morning, the older soldier lingered behind as the others mounted their horses. He stood near the well, warming his hands over a small brazier that sputtered in the windless chill. You watched from a distance as your father approached him again, cautiously, like one man seeking truth from another, not command. You followed, steps soft in the frost, and listened as the soldier finally began to speak, not like a messenger delivering news, but like someone emptying a burden he'd carried too long. Even Constantinople is starving, he said flatly. That should tell you something. Your father said nothing, waiting. The sun doesn't rise there either, not really. Lamps burn all day, in palaces and churches. Fires in the streets, smoke everywhere. The light's wrong, like in here, but heavier. The sky sits low, the wind feels poisoned. And food? Your father asked. The soldier let out a dry breath that might have been a laugh. Gone. Prices are madness. A sack of flour costs more than a month's wage. Bread riots every other day. The poor raid grain carts. The rich hide behind walls. Priests chant in the squares, while corpses are buried in the alleys. Even the patriarch can't explain what's happening. Some say it's divine fury. Others say the emperor angered the saints. But most have stopped talking. They're too hungry to speak. You saw it then, not just in his words, but in the way his hands trembled slightly as he wrapped his cloak tighter. He wasn't just delivering bad news. He had lived it, walked its streets, smelled the sickness of rot, heard the begging of children clawing at shuttered doors. Is it safer there? So your father asked, finally voicing what many had been wondering. The soldier looked at him, long and hard. Depends. If you want to die with a crowd, then yes. The words hung like smoke in the air. That night, as the soldiers left, and the fire at the well burned low, the village stirred with new tension. Whispers began circulating. Not just about hunger or weather, but about the road, the city, the idea of movement, of leaving. Some said it made sense. If there was food to be found anywhere, it would be in the capital. The emperor wouldn't let his city starve completely, would he? The churches had cellars. The nobles had granaries. Some thought there might be mercy there. Others argued the opposite, that if the capital was dying, then the rest of the world had already been abandoned. At your home, your father said little. He sat near the hearth with your mother, the two of them speaking in murmurs, glancing now and then at the worn map spread across the table. The road to the capital was long, dangerous. You'd have to cross mountain paths, cold rivers, abandoned villages. And even if you made it, there was no promise of shelter, no certainty of kindness, just more mouths, more need. I won't take them into worse, your mother said, her voice flat with exhaustion. I won't trade frost for famine. Your father didn't answer immediately. He traced the road on the map with one finger, then leaned back in his chair and stared into the fire. But what if there's nothing left here either? The conversation repeated in other homes. Some villagers argued that staying meant slow death, that waiting for the frost to thaw was just postponing the inevitable. Others said the city would only devour them faster. One family had already left. Now others considered it too. You could feel it in the way people looked at the horizon, not with hope, but with the bitter calculation of risk. A gamble. Everything had become a gamble. The word Constantinople lost its shape. It wasn't just a city anymore. It was a symbol of something bigger, of desperation, of belief that somewhere someone must know what was happening, must have a plan, a solution, an answer. But deep down, even as people whispered, even as your father touched the map again that night and traced the route south, you understood what no one said aloud. The empire was cracking, not from war, not from enemies, but from hunger and silence, from skies that refused to move, from a world that had turned its back and left all its people stranded in the same unending day. And there was no place, not even behind the golden walls of the capital, where the sun had returned. They waited 3 more days before deciding, not because anything changed, nothing ever changed now, but because it took that long to let go of the hope they no longer believed in. On the 3rd evening, when the wind passed through the trees without bending a single branch, and the air smelled faintly of ash, your father looked across the frost-covered field one last time and said, "We can't stay." Your mother didn't argue. She stood still for a long while, staring at the roofline of your home, her lips pressed tight. The house was cold, the hearth nearly out, and even the familiar creak of the shutters no longer brought comfort. Your siblings sat near the fire, too tired to ask questions anymore, and you didn't want to leave, but you also didn't want to stay. Not really. The village had turned into a place where silence lived between every wall, and warmth had become a memory. Wordlessly, the packing began. There was little to take: 2 bundles of clothing, a sack of dried roots, a tightly bound pouch of grain meant for planting. Your father wrapped his tools in a cloth, though none of them had touched living soil in weeks. Your mother tucked a piece of carved wood into her bag, something from before, something for after, though you didn't know what it meant anymore. You filled a water skin and carried your blanket, still heavy with the smell of smoke and winter. That night, no one slept, not from fear, not even from hunger, but from the weight of what morning would mean. Leaving the village was not like walking away from a place. It was like leaving behind the idea that this world could ever return to what it was. Your home wasn't just a house. It was your grandmother's voice on summer evenings. It was the worn bench your father had built with his own hands, the way the trees sounded in spring, the kitchen full of boiled herbs and bread crust. Even the dirt had once felt like part of you. Now all of it was fading into something unfamiliar. At dawn, or what they now called dawn, the family gathered their things and stepped outside. The sky, as always, hung like a faded shroud overhead. No sun, no gold, just that endless bruised blue. Your little sister cried without sound. Your mother held her close and didn't speak. Your father took one last look at the barn, then turned toward the road. You followed behind, your feet reluctant, your heart stuck somewhere between the fields and the future. Others watched you leave. Faces appeared at windows, at door frames, behind fences. No one called out, so no one said goodbye. It was as if watching you go reminded them that they might have to follow, or that they never would. The weight of your footsteps was louder than words. Each one echoed with the sound of a door closing behind you. Past the last house, The path turned harder. The frost lay thick, even on the stones. The fields on either side were empty, silent. You could still see the outlines of plow marks, frozen in place, like scars that never had time to heal. The forest loomed ahead, not wild, but uncertain, filled with the possibility of both shelter and danger. Your father kept the pace steady. Your mother walked in silence, one hand on your younger brother's shoulder. You wanted to ask where you were going. You didn't. You already knew, forward. By midday, the village was no longer visible behind you, just a smudge on the horizon, swallowed by haze. Your home was gone now, not in body, but in belonging. You knew you would never sleep under that roof again, never see the sun fall across its walls. Even if it still stood, even if the frost melted, it would not be the same. As you climbed the first ridge, you turned once just for a moment. The sky above you was still empty, the light still thin, and in that moment, something inside you shifted. You weren't just walking away from a house, a village, or a season. You were leaving a world that no longer existed, a life that had already ended without ceremony. Ahead lay the unknown, a long road, a broken empire, a sky without warmth. But it was the only road left. And so, like the first falling leaf that knows it will never return to the branch, your family walked on. The road was not empty. You thought it would be silent, lonely, vast, but it was crowded with ghosts of the living. Families walking in silence, children too tired to cry, elders carried on makeshift sleds or leaning on sticks, moving forward not from will, but because stopping meant surrender. The path was caked in a gray film, dry and clinging, rising into the air with each footstep. It wasn't dust, not like the kind from summer fields. It was heavier, finer. Ash, someone whispered, from the sky, from the mountains, from the world above that was still burning somewhere far beyond sight. The silence of the road was not like the silence of the village. This was a silence made of breath and bone. People spoke in murmurs, if at all. Each face looked the same, drawn, hollow-eyed, smeared with frost and soot. 1,000 stories, and none of them needed telling. Hunger makes everyone equal. You walked with your family at the edge of the line, your father ahead, his eyes fixed forward, one hand on the strap of the bundle across his back. Your siblings clung to your mother, who moved more slowly than before. She had twisted her ankle 2 days out, on a jagged root beneath the snow-crusted mud. She didn't scream, just gasped, sat still, and then got up. But you saw the limp. You saw the pain she tried to hide. At night, when she thought no one was watching, she would rub her swollen foot and wince through her teeth. Your father offered to carry her once. She shook her head. "No one can carry two," she said. "We all walk, or none of us do." But by the third day, her limp was worse. The ground had turned slick with frost, and she stumbled more often. Each misstep slowed you down, and you knew, sooner or later, the road would not wait. Your father began moving ahead more often, scouting food, watching the trail. You stayed behind. You weren't told to, but it happened. The decision passed in silence, like breath exchanged in cold air. You took your mother's arm, helped her walk, led your siblings. When the group stopped for rest, you found the driest spot. When the bread was passed, you rationed it. When your brother began to shiver too hard to speak, you wrapped your own cloak around his shoulders and told him it was fine. that warmth would come, that it was close. He nodded and didn't answer. He was too young to lie, but he didn't call out the lie either. That was something you hadn't noticed before, how silence could become a form of love. You saw other families fall behind. Some sat by the trees and didn't rise again. Some begged others to carry a child, a sack, a blanket. Most passed them by. Not out of cruelty, there was just nothing left to give. One old man offered his boots to a coughing girl who limped barefoot through the ash. Her mother took them, eyes wide with shock, but said nothing. The old man sat down afterward and didn't stand up again. On the fourth day, a group of soldiers passed by without stopping. Not the kind like before. These were leaner, dirtier, their armor spotted with soot. They didn't speak, didn't even look. One dragged a wooden cart with no wheels, just runners carved for ice. There was something wrapped in cloth inside. You didn't want to know what. They moved like men who had seen too much and expected nothing more. By the time you reached the river fork, your mother could barely walk. Your father carved a staff for her from a fallen branch, stripped of bark and wrapped at the top with cloth from your old shirt. She leaned heavily on it, teeth clenched. The road was no longer a path. It was an ordeal, but she didn't ask to stop. That night, as you built the fire from damp twigs and watched the smoke curl low under the heavy sky, your father looked at you differently, not like a child, not like someone to shield, but like someone who had already stepped forward. "You're watching the others," he said. "Good. Watch their eyes. That's where the truth is." You didn't understand fully, but you nodded, and you did watch. You saw the hollow stares, the way people hunched their shoulders, protected their sacks, the way some families formed tighter circles at night, the way hands trembled, not from cold, but from the effort of keeping calm. You walked each day with your hand on your mother's back. You rationed the bread, saved the last dried fig for your sister when she coughed blood one morning. You tied the blanket tighter around your brother when the wind picked up. You stepped between your family and the strangers who stared too long. You didn't ask to lead, but leadership comes not in command, but in responsibility, and it had chosen you now. Ahead, the road wound onward, toward the capital, toward more frost, more hunger, more questions. Behind, your village was a ghost. Around you, the world had turned to ash. But within, a quiet strength grew, the kind born not of power, but of the refusal to let go. Not yet. The city rose from the haze like a stone mirage. Gray towers, domes barely catching the cold light, walls so wide and high they looked like the edge of the world itself. Constantinople, the capital, the end of the road. For days, it had been just a word, a direction, a promise that kept your legs moving. Now it was real, massive, impenetrable, and closed. You saw it before you reached it. The crowds, hundreds, no, thousands of others, just like you, families wrapped in rags, soldiers on broken horses, priests carrying icons, starving children in their fathers' arms, all pressed against the outer gates of the city, shouting, pleading, waving whatever papers or coins they had left. And above them, from the towers and walkways of the walls, the guards shouted back, not with threats, but with orders. Only citizens, they called, only those with imperial tokens may enter. It made no sense at first. What token? What citizen? But then someone beside you held up a coin-sized medallion, bronze, marked with the sigil of the eagle, and the guard nodded. That man and his family were pulled through. The rest were pushed back. You felt the panic ripple through the crowd like heat. People surged forward, voices rising. Mothers shouted their children's names. Men tried to climb the stone steps, only to be shoved down with spears. A woman near you fell, and no one helped her up. Her cries were lost beneath boots. Your father gripped your arm tightly, pulling you close, your siblings packed in around you, your mother limping behind. The press of bodies was suffocating. You felt breath on your neck, the weight of people behind you, in front of you, all fighting for the same invisible space. Someone yelled that the gate would open again. Someone else screamed that it wouldn't. Someone began praying. Another cursed the Emperor aloud. And above it all, the guards kept repeating the same line. Tokens only, citizens only. No entry. You tried to speak to one of them, an older man with a beard and tired eyes, but he didn't look down. He stared straight ahead as if you were already gone, already part of the dust. You heard someone say that people had been waiting here for days, that others had died in the crush, that at night the guards closed the gates and lit no fires, letting the darkness do the work no sword would. Your mother stumbled. You caught her just before she fell, your shoulder under her arm. Her lips were pale, her eyes unfocused. She wasn't speaking anymore. Your father looked at her, then at the crowd, then back at the walls. You saw it in his face. This wasn't a gate. It was a wall, a final one. That night, you slept on cold stones just outside the gate, surrounded by coughing, shivering bodies. The air smelled of unwashed skin and desperation. No one lit a fire. No one dared, but the talk didn't stop. Whispers passed like wind. There's a way in, someone said, at the port. They're letting a few through. Workers, dock hands, anyone strong enough to carry. Another voice added, it's not official, but the port guards are taking bribes, or pity, or both. Your father said nothing, but the next morning you followed him through the maze of side paths and winding alleys that led down the slope toward the Bosphorus. The air smelled different there, salt and rot. Ships bobbed on gray water. Thin ropes snapped in the wind. There was movement, but it was slow, controlled. A small group was being allowed through one by one, men and women with strong arms, calloused hands, workers, laborers, useful bodies. The guards here didn't ask for tokens. They asked for names, skills, ages. You heard one say, if he can haul crates, he can eat. Another, no children, we can't feed them. You felt your father tense. His hands opened and closed. You knew the look. He was choosing, weighing, not between leaving and staying, but between what to say and what lie might save you. Then something happened you didn't expect. Your mother stepped forward, limping, pale, barely upright. But she looked the soldier in the eyes and said, I can cook, I can boil anything. I can make broth from bones and stones. Her voice was dry, cracking but strong. The guard paused, looked her up and down, then turned to your father. And you? Carpenter, he said quickly, strong back. The soldier hesitated again, eyes shifting toward you and your siblings. Too many mouths, he muttered. Then you spoke. You didn't plan it, but it came out. I can carry, you said. I can lift sacks. I can help. He looked at you for too long, then waved you through. No celebration, no joy, just movement. You passed through a side gate, low, iron, half-rusted. the city swallowed you, and behind the crowd remained, pressed against the stone, waiting, hoping, or preparing to turn back into ash. His name was Demetrios. You didn't learn it until later. At first, he was just the boy in the red wool cloak, too clean for someone outside the gates, too calm for someone surrounded by so much collapse. He stood near the dock's edge, arms folded, scanning the crowds not with fear, but with focus. His hair was cropped short, his boots were real leather, and when his eyes met yours, it wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. Not of you, but of your shape, your state, your place in this tide of the desperate. You'd seen him earlier that morning, speaking to one of the guards at the port gate, low and fast, like someone used to making deals. You thought he was a thief at first, or maybe a city boy sent down by someone rich to scavenge servants from the starving. But then your mother saw him and froze. Her hand went to her mouth, and the pain in her eyes melted into something else. Hope, then disbelief, then trembling. "Demetrios?" she whispered, so quiet it almost wasn't there. The boy turned. And for a moment, time did something strange, stopped, or slowed, or forgot itself. He stared at her, blinked once, then took 2 steps forward. "Mother?" And suddenly, he was running. She nearly collapsed as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her up, burying his face in her shoulder. His voice cracked. Hers was gone. Your father stood still, unsure, a hand half lifted in confusion. You didn't know what was happening, not until they pulled apart and she turned toward you all. "My sister's son," she said. "He left for the city 5 years ago. I thought he was gone." He looked older than you by only a few years, maybe 16, 17, but he moved like a man already hardened by the world. When he looked at your father, his face shifted, not unfriendly, but cautious. "You're the ones from Tralles?" he asked. "She told me she had family near the hills." Your father nodded slowly. "We were." "Not anymore?" Demetrios glanced at the crowd behind you, the gates, the guards, the black-streaked sky above. "You won't last out here." "We know." He looked down for a moment, then motioned with his head. "Come with me." No one questioned him. Maybe it was because your mother trusted him. Maybe because you had no other choice. You followed him past the wharves, around crumbling walls and collapsed storehouses, into a part of the port shielded from view. It smelled of fish, salt, damp wood, but also of safety. He led you through a broken archway where the stones were charred and the moss grew in long, wet fingers down the wall. Inside was a small courtyard, half covered by an awning of patched linen. A fire burned low in a clay pit. 3 other people huddled near it, an old man with a limp, a woman nursing a baby too small to cry, and a boy younger than you with soot on his face. "They're with me too," Demetrios said. "I found them yesterday." He helped your mother sit, unwrapped a cloth bundle, and handed her a piece of bread, not much, but thicker than anything you'd seen in weeks. Your siblings stared. He tore it in half and passed it around. "There's not much here," he said, "but it's better than the gate. I know the alleys. I know who to talk to. You'll be safe here if you stay quiet." Your father watched him closely. "Why help us?" Demetrios looked down. His voice was quiet when he answered. "Because someone helped me once, and because she's family." He spent the next hour gathering kindling, speaking with a woman who appeared from another archway, trading 2 buttons for a handful of dried lentils. He moved like someone with purpose, not just surviving, but weaving something from the scraps. You saw the others look at him the way people look at fire in the dark, as something fragile but vital. He wasn't strong the way soldiers were, he was sharp. And in this city of hunger, sharpness kept you alive. That night, when the wind howled through the gaps in the stone, you curled beneath your blanket and listened as he and your father whispered near the fire. Plans, routes, names. You caught only fragments, cistern tunnels, East Quarter, market stacks, but the sound of it gave you comfort. He wasn't guessing. He knew this city, and now, somehow, you were part of it. You couldn't explain it, but you felt it already. Your path had turned. Your family's survival no longer rested only on your father's strength or your mother's will. It rested on Demetrios, a boy born of the same blood, shaped by different winds, now standing like a hinge between your old life and something still unnamed. And though you didn't know where the story was heading, one thing was clear. Without him, you wouldn't survive it. The city looked like something carved out of dusk. Constantinople, name of power, of emperors and miracles, lay draped in permanent twilight, her domes ghostly under the gray sky, her streets narrow and winding like veins in an old hand. There was a beauty here, yes, but it was the beauty of something wounded, something still breathing but not healed, not whole. From the upper quarter near the walls, you could see the distant shimmer of the Hagia Sophia's dome, pale gold dulled by layers of soot. Bells no longer rang at dawn, not because time didn't pass, but because no one was sure what dawn even meant anymore. The city moved in shadows. Smoke hung between buildings, thick with the scent of ash, boiled grain, and too many unwashed bodies. And everywhere, lines, lines for bread, lines for water, lines for silence. People no longer walked with pride. They hunched their shoulders, eyes down, hands close to their sides. Even the noble quarters had begun to decay. Once glittering mosaics were veiled in grime. Statues wore cloaks of moss. Marble steps cracked and shifted as if the earth beneath them had grown tired. Yet the markets still operated. Merchants whispered their prices behind shutters. Peddlers crouched in alleys, offering bowls of watered wine or charred meat of uncertain origin. And soldiers, they were everywhere. Not marching, not protecting, just standing, watching, spears grounded, faces blank. Demetrios led you through the maze with ease. He knew which bridges had collapsed, which buildings had turned to rat dens, which gates you had to bribe, and which ones you had to avoid entirely. He took you south, past what had once been the baths, now filled with the homeless, and deeper into the belly of the city. Finally, he stopped before an old grain storehouse, its front boarded and burned, but its foundation still strong. "In here," he said. A narrow stairwell descended beneath the floorboards, winding into a chamber that had once stored sacks of wheat. It was dark, damp, but safe. Someone had cleared the debris and laid out layers of cloth for bedding. There were cracked amphorae in the corner, a pile of kindling, a broken bench, no windows, one narrow slit for air, but there was quiet, and a door. "This is home now," he said, setting down the bundle of food he'd bartered for that morning, "for as long as we need it to be." That night, for the first time in weeks, you slept without watching the stars. There were none left to see anyway. The days began to blend. Each one felt the same, dim, cold, brittle. You rose early and helped Demetrios scavenge. Some mornings you went to the soup lines. If you were early enough, you might get half a bowl of barley paste. Some days he took you across the aqueduct, where he knew a nun who traded dried herbs for labor. Your mother stayed in the cellar, her ankles still stiff, but her hands never idle. She mended torn sleeves, boiled thin broth from scraps, murmured songs under her breath to keep the younger children from drifting into silence. You began to see the city through Demetrios's eyes, not as one place, but as layers. Above were the streets of the living, thin and gray and filled with moving bodies. Below were tunnels, cisterns, collapsed halls of forgotten homes where you could slip past the hunger if you were fast and clever. And in between, the waiting. Everyone was waiting for something. The end, the thaw, a sign, but none came. The soldiers no longer questioned strangers. They stopped asking who you were or why you were there. The guards at the granaries didn't care who starved. The priests kept praying, their voices hoarse from smoke and sorrow. And each night in the lower ward, more people came, sleeping on rooftops, in alleys, under carts. Constantinople had become a city of breath held in. No one dared exhale too loudly. In the cellar, your family learned a new rhythm. Your father went out early with Demetrios, worked wherever he could. You helped gather firewood when you could find it, or walked the outer markets with a basket and a promise of trade. Your siblings grew quieter, not sick, just changed, their voices smaller, their questions fewer, and still the sky did not change. That endless veil of gray blue where the sun used to rise hung motionless. The city existed not in night or day, but in pause, in a world where no season followed the next, and the light was always tired, yet you survived, not because the city gave you anything, but because Demetrios taught you how to take only what wouldn't draw attention. Because your mother made soup out of stems and hope. Because your father's hands, cracked and shaking, still worked. And because somewhere deep inside you, a voice kept saying, "Not yet, not today." The city was no longer beautiful, but in its brokenness, it had given you something no village ever had: perspective. You were one of thousands, part of something larger than your own hunger. And somehow, in that place between fear and forward motion, you began to change too. You were no longer just a child in the frost. You were a witness, and now, whether you liked it or not, you were part of the story. His name was Theo, and you met him over a piece of bread that wasn't yours. It was early morning, or at least the hour when most began to stir in the half-light of the city. You were standing in line at one of the relief kitchens near the old forum, an operation run by monks who served what little they had out of cracked cauldrons behind a scorched stone wall. The line moved slowly, not because there was much to give, but because everyone still hoped there might be something at the end of it. Your fingers were cold around the small wooden bowl Demetrios had traded for, the kind that held just enough broth to be worth waiting hours for. Then the shouting started. Not the usual kind. No scuffles, no children whining, no merchants yelling deals from behind shutters. This was deeper, angrier, a sound that pulled up from the stomach, not the throat. You turned in time to see a man, skinny, wild-eyed, shaking, lunge toward the cart where the soup was being ladled. He grabbed a whole loaf of bread, shriveled and burned at the edge, and ran. The monk who had been serving shouted something and followed. Then another man shouted. Then a woman screamed. And suddenly the air was filled with motion. The line collapsed into chaos. People surged forward, not to fight, not at first, but to reach, to grab. The cauldron tipped. The soup spilled. Someone threw a stone. Someone else shouted, "They're hiding food." And then, as if the city itself had cracked open, the crowd turned into something else entirely. You backed away, pushing through legs, ducking beneath arms, trying not to fall. When you reached the side alley, your bowl long lost and your heart pounding, you stumbled into a boy crouched behind a broken column, his eyes wide, arms full of torn bread and something wrapped in cloth. He looked about your age. His hair was a mess, his face smudged with ash, but his eyes were sharp, like Demetrios's, but younger, wounded in a different way. "Take one," he said without hesitation, holding out a chunk of bread. You hesitated. "Take it," he repeated. "I got too much, wasn't planning to, just happened." You took it. It was warm, not soft, but real. You nodded. "Thanks." "I'm Theo," he said, and that was that. From that day, he started showing up. Not at the cellar, but around the city, near the docks, at the broken aqueduct, on the rooftops where smoke gathered thickest. He didn't have a family, at least none he talked about. Said he had been living in the ruins near the Hippodrome, sleeping in the skeleton of an old merchant's house that no one wanted anymore. You didn't ask questions, neither did he. That was how it worked now. One afternoon, you both followed the sound of shouting up toward the forum again. Another riot. Not about one loaf this time, but many. A rumor had spread that a noble's cellar was full of grain, guarded by soldiers who were eating better than the priests. By the time you got there, the street was on fire. Not fully, just patches. Smoke rising from carts, a barrel split open and smoldering. People screamed, some weeping, some wild with fury. Theo gripped your arm. "Look!" A group of women, thin, wrapped in layers of linen and fury, were throwing stones at the doors of a marble villa. A soldier tried to push them back, but they surged again, screaming about children, about lies, about hunger. And then the door burst open from the inside, not to welcome them, but to let more soldiers out. Real ones, armed, they didn't speak, just moved. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a collapse. People ran. You and Theo ducked behind a wall as the women scattered, one falling hard and not getting back up. The soldiers didn't chase. They just stood guard like statues, unmoved by what they'd just done. Theo spat. Not at them, just at the ground. "They'll kill the city before they feed it," he muttered. You didn't answer, because he wasn't wrong. That night, back in the cellar, you told Demetrios what you saw. He nodded, slow, heavy. "There will be more," he said. "Sooner or later, the bread riots become real riots." And Theo? He started coming more often, bringing scraps, news, warnings. He was fast, fearless, reckless in the way only a boy with nothing left to lose can be. But loyal, always watching for you in the crowd, always splitting whatever he found, even when it wasn't enough. In a city where hope was rationed, Theo was something rare. Not a hero, not a savior, but a friend. One who stood beside you in the broken streets, in the smoke and fury, and said, "I see you. I choose you. And in that world of hunger and betrayal, that was more than enough. It began as a whisper, passed between priests, murmured by scholars, scrawled in broken ink on damp scraps of parchment that somehow found their way through the city. A single word, like a curse, volcano. You heard it first from Theo. He ran into the cellar one morning, cheeks flushed from cold and running, his voice low but urgent. It wasn't God, he said, breathless. It was the earth. At first, no one believed it, not because it was too strange, but because it sounded too ordinary, too explainable. For months, the sky had been sealed in iron. The light refused to rise. The cold clung to every stone. And people needed this to mean something: divine punishment, a test, a prophecy fulfilled. But now they said it was a mountain, far away, somewhere beyond the seas. A fire beneath the ground that had erupted with such violence that the sky itself choked. Demetrios nodded slowly when you repeated it. He had heard it too, from a Roman sailor with cracked teeth and a scarred face who'd come through the port looking for wine and warmth. There was a sun once, the man said, but then the sky swallowed it. The fire came from the east, black rain, and the clouds haven't moved since. Whether it was true didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone started to believe it. And that belief changed something. Because if it was a volcano, then the darkness wasn't just punishment, it was permanence. You began to notice it the very next day. The ash. It didn't fall like snow. It floated, soft, weightless, until it touched your skin. Then it stuck. Gray, fine, clinging to your clothes, your hair, the cracks of your fingers. It coated rooftops, settled in cups left uncovered, lined the inside of your mouth if you breathed too deeply. At first it came lightly, like a memory, then heavier, then constantly. The city grew quieter, not from peace, but from effort. People coughed more. Children cried dry tears. The monks at the soup kitchens covered their pots. The guards wrapped scarves over their faces. Even the soldiers wore veils of linen now, as if fighting a sickness no one could name. Inside the cellar, the air turned thick. The single slit of a window now let in not just cold, but soot. Your mother stuffed it with cloth. Demetrios lined the walls with canvas, soaked in vinegar. It helped for a while. You saw less of the stars, less of the world. The light that did filter through had changed. It wasn't just dim, it was wrong. The ash refracted it, bent it, scattered it like broken glass. Shadows grew in places they hadn't before. The city took on the look of a burned painting, edges curling, colors drained. People spoke less, moved less. Food was impossible to grow now. Whatever seedlings had sprouted in the hidden gardens were choked with ash. The grain stores were emptying faster than expected. The bakeries stopped lighting fires. It was too dangerous. Sparks meant flame, and flame meant the whole block could disappear in minutes. One night, you woke to the smell of smoke, different from the daily haze. This was sharp, real, alive. A fire had broken out in the lower quarter. It swept through 6 houses before the wind dragged it into a broken aqueduct where the stone finally killed it. But it left behind a trail of ruin, charred beams, families with nothing, a row of blackened corpses wrapped in their own cloaks. The city wasn't dying fast, it was dying slow. Theo, who once darted through alleyways like a fox, now moved more cautiously. "They're talking about leaving," he said one morning. "Some of the port guards, south maybe, or west. wherever the ash hasn't reached. But the ash is everywhere, you said. He didn't answer, just looked up at the sky. Demetrios, meanwhile, had grown quieter. He spent long hours mapping routes through the tunnels, stockpiling what little food remained. He spoke less to your father now, not out of anger, but out of planning. His mind had moved to something beyond survival, and you stopped asking when the sun would return. That question had become too heavy. You helped your mother boil water through cloth, caught ash in bowls, tried to sweep it from the floor, though it always came back. You didn't cry. You didn't scream. There was no point. Grief required energy, and you had none to spare. The ash kept falling, and with it came the truth that the world you had known was not coming back. The fields, the seasons, the light that made mornings mean something. All of it had vanished into the throat of a mountain you would never see. It wasn't fair, but it was real. And now, beneath that suffocating sky, in a city collapsing beneath its own weight, you faced the only future that remained, whatever you could build from ash and fire. It was your father's idea, though no one spoke of it aloud. In a city where breathing felt like treason and boiling water required strategy, the thought of growing anything seemed foolish, romantic even. But one morning, he rose before the rest of you, wrapped a length of rope around his waist, and said he was going to the west wall. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. You followed him a few days later, curious, cautious, drawn by something more than hunger. What you found was not a field, not even a garden, but a crack in the city's skin. A narrow strip of dirt tucked into the curve where the great western wall met a collapsed watchtower. The space was barely wider than a donkey cart, hidden by the shadows of stone and the weight of forgetting. But it was dirt, untouched, unclaimed. And in that strip, your father had planted life. Not much. Just a few struggling shoots, radish, maybe, or onion roots that didn't need much light, that clung to the ground like it owed them something. He'd cleared the ash with his hands, dug channels with a broken spoon, hauled water in a wineskin from the aqueduct ruins 2 streets away. His hands were raw, his back bent, but the plants were there. You knelt beside them, touched the soil, damp, cold, so real. When he saw you, he didn't smile, just nodded. "We don't speak of this," he said. "Not to anyone, not even your mother." You understood immediately, because in Constantinople, even hope had become a crime. It wasn't just about food. In the early days of the darkness, when the fields failed and the gardens withered, the empire had passed a decree. All attempts to grow crops within the city were to be supervised, taxed, and controlled. Unauthorized gardens were considered hoarding, subversion, a threat to the managed chaos of rationed survival. You'd heard the stories. A boy caught tending to beans in a rooftop pot, beaten. A woman arrested for hiding wheat seeds in her cellar. There were laws now against everything that used to be normal. And so, your father's secret garden became not just a gamble, but rebellion. You kept the secret, watered when he couldn't, dug small trenches after rain, gathered ash into pouches and dumped it further down the street. Theo helped too, silent, efficient. He'd stand watch near the edge of the alley, throwing pebbles against the wall if he saw a patrol nearby. Demetrios said nothing, but you knew he knew. He let it be. Days passed, then a week, then 2, and one morning a miracle. A sprout, green, upright, unburned, pushed through the dirt like a promise. You stared at it as though it might disappear. It didn't. Your father touched its leaf and nodded once as if he'd spoken to it in a language only they shared. You wanted to tell your mother. You wanted to bring your sister to see it. But you didn't. You all knew better. Instead, it became your ritual. At dusk, when the city sank into its shallow sleep, you and your father would slip away, sometimes in silence, sometimes in whispers. You'd check the plants, brush off the ash, pour precious spoonfuls of water into the roots. It wasn't enough. But it was something. And in a world where even breath felt rationed, something was everything. But the city noticed. Not the garden yet, but the change. Rumors began to swirl that people were hiding food, that someone had stolen seeds from the imperial granary. The patrols grew more aggressive. Soldiers began searching homes not for weapons, but for dirt. A man was dragged through the forum, accused of harboring cabbage under his floorboards. They beat him until he bled ash. You wanted to stop. Your father didn't. They can take everything, he said, eyes fixed on the stones, but they won't take the will. And yet, you felt it coming. One night, as you approached the corner of the ruined watchtower, you saw the shape first, dark, hunched, motionless. A guard. He hadn't noticed the garden, not yet, just patrolling. But he was close, too close. You backed away, breath tight, hand on your father's sleeve. He didn't move, just stared, not at the soldier, but at the plants, as if memorizing them, saying goodbye. You left the garden that night and didn't return. Not the next day, not the one after. The city pressed tighter around you. The ash fell harder. But in your mind, the shoots still grew, silently, stubbornly, in that forgotten patch of earth. Maybe they were still there. Maybe someone else would find them. Or maybe they would wither, curl into the dust, and vanish. But for a moment, for those few stolen weeks, you had grown something real in a world designed to erase. And that was enough to carry you one more day. It started with a smell, earthy, faint, and oddly comforting. Not the sour tang of rot or the biting reek of ash, but something softer, something ancient. You noticed it first near the far wall of the cellar, behind the stack of broken amphorae and old burlap sacks. It didn't seem important. Not until Demetrios moved one of the sacks and pointed. Mushrooms. Not many. A dozen, maybe. Pale, squat, pushing out of the moist stone like quiet guests that had been waiting patiently for their time to speak. At first, you didn't believe it. Food didn't just appear, not anymore, but there they were, sprouting in the damp where the condensation from the walls dripped just enough to mimic nature. No sun, no soil, just time, darkness, and stillness. Demetrios leaned closer, sniffed, then broke off one of the caps and bit it carefully, chewing with the slow calculation of someone who'd been poisoned before. He swallowed, waited, then nodded. Edible, he said simply. The next morning, your father used a shard of clay pot to cut them gently at the base. Your mother boiled them with a sliver of dried carrot she'd been saving for your sister's cough. The broth it produced was thin, but fragrant. The kind of taste that reminded you of before, not because it was rich or filling, but because it was earned, grown, yours. That night, the air in the cellar shifted. It wasn't joy. No one laughed, but something else breathed in with the steam of the broth. Hope, a fragile, flickering thing, born not from stories or rumors or faraway rescues, but from the stone beneath your feet. Theo grinned when he tasted the soup. Tastes like victory, he whispered. And you believed him. You started watching the mushrooms more closely, checking the wall each morning, marking new growth. It became a ritual, sacred and quiet. Your siblings took turns misting the stones with boiled water. Your father reinforced the corner with bricks to protect against rats. Even Demetrios began saving crumbs and vegetable peels to rot in the dark, a way to feed the fungi and maybe feed yourselves. Then your mother fell ill. It wasn't sudden. You'd seen the signs, the shallow breathing, the moments where she stopped moving mid-task, eyes fixed on nothing. At first, she brushed it off. Just tired, she said, just cold. But her voice trembled, her hands shook when she stirred the pot. And one morning, she didn't rise at all. Your sister curled beside her, watching. Your father tried to boil water, but even his hands weren't steady. He paced the cellar like a caged animal. You brought her the broth, gently, slowly, but she could barely sip. Theo brought dried berries he'd traded for. Demetrios offered strips of cloth soaked in vinegar. Nothing helped. Hope turned sideways, became fear. You stared at the mushrooms and hated them for their timing, because how cruel to give a sign of life when death, or something close to it, was sinking into the corner of your home. You sat by her side one night when the city above was silent and the air so thick with ash it felt like cloth over your mouth. She opened her eyes for a moment, just long enough to look at you. Her fingers twitched in yours. She smiled barely. "Did they grow again?" she asked. You nodded. 3 more today." She closed her eyes. "Good," she whispered. "Feed them first." That night, you didn't sleep. You watched her chest rise and fall in shallow rhythm, unsure which breath might be the last. But she kept breathing, slowly, quietly, and so did you. In the corner, the mushrooms grew, pale, soft, alive. It wasn't enough to save her, not yet. But it was enough to remind you why she fought, why you all still did. Because even now, in this world of darkness and ash and silence, something still chose to grow. And that meant you had to choose it too. It began with a scream, high, sharp, not of pain, but of fury. Then another, then many. You were by the aqueduct when you heard it, crouched beside Demetrios as he adjusted a hidden cache of roots and stale bread under the stone. The noise rolled over the city like a wave, shouting, breaking, surging. You stood up and saw smoke, thick and black, rising from the southern quarter, like a fist tearing at the sky. A moment later, the bells rang, not the solemn toll of ritual, but a frantic clanging, uneven and panicked. Demetrios didn't wait. The granary. He ran. You followed. The streets had never been calm, but now they were wild, people running not away from danger, but toward it. A fire meant stored food, and food meant survival. You passed a woman barefoot, dragging a sack that spilled barley as she ran. A boy shoved you aside, his hands covered in soot. A soldier tried to block a street with his spear, only to be knocked down by the mob. Order didn't just collapse, it vanished. By the time you reached the square, the fire had taken the main storehouse. Flames licked the sky, hungry and bright, illuminating the ash-choked air with a color no one had seen in months, orange. Not the warmth of sunrise, but the violence of destruction. It was beautiful in a way that made your stomach turn. Your father was already there, shouting for you over the roar. Your mother, pale and shivering, stood beside him, wrapped in the same cloak she had worn when you left the village. The younger children clung to her legs, eyes wide, not from the fire, but from the people, because the fire wasn't the only danger. The crowd had lost its shape. What began as desperation had turned into madness. They tore at the doors of nearby homes. They screamed at shadows. Some threw stones at the soldiers. Others threw bread, moldy, burning, symbolic. They didn't want order anymore. They wanted reckoning. Then came the crack. One of the warehouse beams gave way with a sound like the sky splitting. Fire burst outward, licking down the street. Sparks flew, caught on cloth, climbed ropes, leapt from stall to stall. It didn't matter that the city was stone. Enough wood remained to carry the flames through the veins of Constantinople, like fever. Your father grabbed your arm. We go in now. To the cellar? You asked. He shook his head. No, it's gone. You didn't ask how he knew. You just ran, down alleys, across stones slick with panic and ash. You passed a man on his knees, praying into the fire, a woman clutching a burned doll. Soldiers now retreated instead of standing their ground. The law had left the city hours ago. Demetrios led you through the tunnels beneath the baths. Theo joined you near the harbor wall, out of breath, clutching a cracked amphora full of mushrooms. He'd gone back for them. Couldn't leave them, he said between gasps. They're ours. The harbor was chaos. Hundreds had the same idea. Escape. The ships were small, creaking, overburdened. Most were private boats, long stripped of paint and dignity. Some tried to barter with the guards. Others shoved their way forward. A few threw themselves into the water, clawing at holes, begging to be pulled aboard. Screams rose above the crashing waves. And there, among the crowd, Demetrios found your chance. A trader he'd once helped smuggle spices. The man was leaving. South, maybe west, he wouldn't say. But there was room. Barely. 2, maybe 3 more. Demetrios turned to your father. Go. What about you? Your father asked. Demetrios didn't answer right away. Then, you have children. I don't. Your mother shook her head. No, we go together. There's no together anymore, Demetrios said. There's only forward. You remember the moment like a dream that burned itself into you. The salt air, the red sky, the shouting. Your father hesitating, your mother whispering something you didn't hear. Then hands, rough, urgent, pulling you up onto the deck. The children next, your mother, then your father. Theo reached up, handed you the sack of mushrooms. Feed her with this, he said. You looked down at him, about to speak, but he was already gone. The boat pulled away. The crowd surged again. Someone threw a rock. A soldier fired an arrow that disappeared into the sea. And the fire, behind you, above the roofs, kept rising, consuming the city not just of stone, but of memory. You didn't cry. There was no time. Just the sound of oars, of waves, of a city burning behind you. And ahead, smoke, water, silence. But in your hands, warm through the cloth, were the mushrooms, the first harvest, the last piece of what you'd made together. A reminder that even in ruin, something lived. You didn't see it happen, not all of it, just pieces, fractured moments blurred by firelight and panic and the heavy thud of your own heartbeat. They had said there was no more room. The captain barked it in 3 languages, his arm barring the plank as if sheer muscle could hold back desperation. Your father was shouting. Your mother pleaded. The children were already on board, two huddled near the stern, faces lit by the reflection of flames from the distant harbor. You stood in the middle, unsure if you were part of the group leaving or the one being left behind. Then Demetrios stepped forward. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply looked the captain in the eye, then at you, and pulled the small brass token from his belt, the one the captain had given him days ago in a quiet deal behind the fish stalls, a guarantee of passage, a debt repaid. He pressed it into your hand. You didn't understand at first. What are you? But he was already turning, his body between you and the sailor, between the sea and the inferno behind it. Go, he said. You're the reason we made it this far. You reached for him. He pulled away gently. Your father moved to speak, but Demetrios shook his head. If he stays, he dies. I can't let you, your mother began, but she stopped because she knew, and so did you. There wasn't time. The ship was pushing back, creaking under the strain of too many souls and too much weight. The deck sloped slightly as oars dipped into the dark water. Someone yelled to cut the rope. A soldier pointed toward the pier. And then Demetrios did something strange, something small. He knelt in front of you. You have to take care of them now, he said. Your father's strong, but he'll need help. Your mother's brave, but she's tired. Your brother watches you. Your sister dreams through you. You nodded, not because you were ready, but because it was the only thing left to do. He smiled just once and ruffled your hair like he had back in the cellar when the mushrooms first grew. Then he stood and walked back into the chaos. That was the last time you saw him. The boat pulled away, slowly, reluctantly. You stood at the edge, eyes fixed on the dock, hoping for one more glimpse. You got it. Just before the smoke swallowed everything, Demetrios turned and looked back, not at the fire, not at the soldiers, but at you. He didn't wave. He didn't cry. He just nodded, and then he was gone. Behind you, your siblings sobbed quietly. Your mother knelt, arms wrapped around her knees. Your father stared at the water like he could carve a path back to the shore with his eyes. You stood still, hands clenched, feet wide. Everything inside you shifted, not with ceremony, not with some grand internal vow, just with certainty. Because childhood ends in different ways. For some, it fades. For others, it's taken. But for you, it burned back there, on the dock, in the space between Demetrios and the sea. You had no home now, no garden, no cellar, no walls to remember the warmth of bread or the sound of your mother humming over the pot. But you had a promise, and you had a memory. That was enough, for now. The sea was not blue. It was the color of lead, of ash dissolved in salt, of something too heavy to be water and too vast to be solid. It moved slowly, sluggishly, as if the sky had seeped into it and made it old. You had expected the sea to feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like waiting. The boat groaned beneath you with every shift of weight, every pull of the oars. It wasn't built for this many people, not for this kind of voyage. A fishing vessel pressed into duty it never asked for. You huddled with your siblings beneath a patchwork of damp cloth and rope near the rear mast that didn't hold a sail anymore, only ragged flags of linen that flapped against the windless air. Your mother slept in fits, her breath shallow. Your father sat upright, always watching the horizon, as if he could will a new world into appearing. No one spoke much. The sea demanded silence. It was as if you were crossing a graveyard. Ash fell here too, not in the same thick curtains as the city, but still fine, dry particles drifting from the sky, settling on the wood, on the skin, in the creases of your mouth and eyes. Some days the sun tried to break through, a sickly yellow glow that hovered behind a veil of cloud, enough to let you believe it still existed, but never enough to warm your face. There was no destination, not really. The captain mumbled about the western coast, about Sicily or further, about ports that might still be open. But the truth was, no one knew. The world had collapsed inward, and this boat was drifting through its bones. People began to cough on the second day, not just one or two, many. A wet, rattling sound that filled the quiet like whispers from under the floorboards. You saw a woman slump against a crate and not get up again. A man retched into the sea, and his wife turned away as if ashamed of his weakness. Your sister developed a fever, not high, but steady. Your mother pressed her lips to the girl's forehead and said nothing. You shared what little you had, mushrooms, a few strips of salted fish someone had left behind, rainwater caught in bowls. It wasn't enough. It never had been. At night, the sea creaked like it was trying to speak. You wrapped your arms around your knees and watched the sky for stars. Once, you thought you saw one, but it might have been a coal spark in your eye, a trick of exhaustion. Still, you kept looking. On the fifth day, something changed. It was early, just past the coldest part of the night, when your father stirred you awake. No words, just a hand on your shoulder. You stood and followed him to the front of the boat. The captain was already there, squinting through a slit in the mist. And then, barely visible, a glow. Not fire, not lightning, not the orange of disaster. This was different. Soft, pale, steady. The sun, not fully, not warm, but present. A disk behind a curtain of gray. A suggestion, a promise. And in that moment the sea changed color. Just slightly. A flicker of green beneath the surface. A hint of what had once been real. People stood, some gasped. One woman fell to her knees. The man who'd been coughing smiled for the first time. It didn't make the ash go away. It didn't erase the dead. But it did something else, something no soup line or guarded granary ever could. It gave you direction. The captain shouted to the crew. The boat shifted course. South by west, he said. Wind was coming. Real wind. You sat beside your sister and watched her chest rise and fall, slower now. Your mother opened her eyes and whispered a word you hadn't heard in weeks. Light. Theo wasn't there. Demetrios was ash on the dock. Your village was gone. The world was still broken. But ahead of you, on that pockmarked, bleeding horizon, was the idea of land, of soil untouched by fire, of sun on stone. It wasn't salvation, but it was a chance. And after everything, that was more than enough. When the land finally appeared, it didn't rise like a promise. It crept into view slowly, like something afraid to show itself. Low hills, uneven shoreline, a faint outline behind the veil of sea haze. But it was real. Earth. Unburned, unburied, unmoving. Sicily. The word itself felt like fiction, something you had heard once in the whispers of merchants back in the capital. Too far, too foreign, too sunlit to be real. And yet here it was, under your feet, as your boots sank into sand that was warm, not with ash or ruin, but with something faintly like life. The moment your toes touched the shore, you realized how tightly you had been holding your breath these past weeks. You let it go slowly, like releasing a secret. The people here didn't smile, but they didn't stare either. That was a gift. They saw the way you stepped off the boat, tattered, hollow, more shadow than shape, and they didn't ask where you'd come from. They already knew, or they guessed enough. You were led to a camp just beyond the dunes, a monastery that had become a shelter, a schoolhouse that had become a granary, a field that had become a field again, because here somehow things still grew. You saw olive trees with leaves, vines with tentative grapes, rows of beans climbing crooked sticks. It looked impossible. The sunlight here was still pale, filtered through veils of smoke from far away, but it was warmer. It stayed longer in the sky, and when it touched your face, it didn't burn, it healed. Food came slowly, measured but sufficient. Bread with actual crust, lentils soft and peppered, once even a fig, shriveled but sweet. Your siblings began to laugh again. Your sister's fever faded. Your mother walked without holding the wall. You caught your father standing in the garden, with his eyes closed, just breathing, not looking for danger, not counting days, just breathing. The mushrooms you carried from the cellar, still wrapped in Theo's sack, were planted by a kindly monk with cracked nails and gentle hands. "Let's see if the old world will follow you here," he said with a wink. You never asked his name, but you liked the sound of his voice. And still, each night, when your siblings curled under borrowed blankets and your parents murmured their quiet prayers, you sat alone by the edge of the olive grove, staring westward, toward nothing, toward memory, because they had stayed. Demetrios on the dock, Theo in the alleyways, and your parents? No, not the ones beside you now, but the ones who had carried you across a dying world. The versions of them that had given everything so you could step foot on this new shore. The ones who had said goodbye the moment you left that cellar, whether they knew it or not. You carried them with you. Every scrape on your arms, every bite of ash you had swallowed, every night you had watched the fire and not turned away. You had aged in silence, and now you were not just a child in a new place. You were a map of everywhere you'd been, everyone you'd lost, everything you'd chosen to survive. One evening, as the wind passed gently through the orchard, your father sat beside you. He didn't speak right away. Then, after a long breath, he said, "We still don't know if they made it." You nodded. He placed something in your palm, a brass token dulled by salt and time. The one Demetrios had given up for you. You had thought it lost. But your father had kept it, carried it across the ash, the fire, the sea. "He saved you," he said simply. You closed your fingers around it, and for the first time, you didn't feel guilt. You felt direction. This place, this Sicily, this fractured sliver of light in a ruined world, was not the end. It was a pause, a breath, a gathering of strength. And one day, when the sky cleared just a little more, when the ground beneath your feet stopped trembling, when your name no longer carried the echo of soot and salt, you would go back, to find out who else had made it, to remember those who hadn't, to build something stronger from the ashes they left behind. Because the story wasn't over. You were still writing it. And now, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, you had light enough to see.